Let me say this as clearly as I can. If you think the biggest danger to Israel right now is only coming from missiles, rockets, drones, or the next strike across the border, then you are only looking at half the picture. Because sometimes the most dangerous shock in a war is not the one that explodes. It is the one that rearranges the political ground under a leader's feet while the battlefield is still on fire. And that may be exactly what is happening to Benjamin Netanyahu right now. Because at the very moment Israel is still trying to manage pressure from Iran's regional network, still trying to hold the line in Lebanon, still trying to project strength after weeks of war, something politically significant just happened inside Israel itself. Two of Netanyahu's biggest rivals, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, have joined forces in a new political alliance aimed directly at challenging him. Reuters reported today that the new party, called Beyachad, is built to confront Netanyahu's coalition and capitalize on growing dissatisfaction inside Israel. And that is not just a campaign story, that is a wartime shock, because leaders can survive military pressure more easily when the political home front stays disciplined. But when political opposition begins to harden into a credible alternative during an active regional crisis, the danger changes shape. Now the question is no longer just whether Israel can absorb the next attack. The question becomes whether Netanyahu can hold together the authority, legitimacy, and strategic clarity needed to deal with what comes next. And right now, that is far from guaranteed. Now here is why this matters more than many people realize. It would be one thing if this political challenge were emerging at a time of calm. It is not. It is emerging while Israel is still facing direct and indirect pressure on multiple fronts. Reuters reported today that Israeli strikes have expanded deeper into eastern Lebanon, into the Bekaa Valley, for the first time since the U.S.-brokered ceasefire began on April 16th. Hezbollah has continued drone and rocket attacks, and the ceasefire already looks far less stable than its supporters hoped. That means Netanyahu is not dealing with one problem. He is dealing with stacked pressure, military pressure, diplomatic pressure, ceasefire pressure, domestic political pressure. And when those pressures start arriving at the same time, even a leader known for surviving crisis after crisis can begin to look less like a tactician in control and more like a man running out of room. That is what makes this moment so dangerous, because the shock is not simply that Bennett and Lapid joined hands. The shock is that they did it at a moment when Netanyahu can least afford a credible challenge. Reuters says the new alliance is unlikely to revolutionize Israeli foreign policy. On Iran, Gaza, Hezbollah, and broader security matters, Bennett and Lapid remain hawkish and broadly supportive of tough military action, but they are attacking Netanyahu from a different angle, not for being too strong, but for failing to convert force into decisive results. Reuters notes that both men have criticized him for failing to eliminate Hamas and failing to solve the Hezbollah threat in a lasting way. And that criticism can be politically lethal, because in wartime, voters often forgive pain more easily than drift. They may accept sacrifice, they may accept risk, they may accept hard decisions. What they struggle to accept is the feeling that the same leader keeps escalating, keeps promising, keeps projecting confidence, and yet the strategic problems keep returning in new forms. That is where Netanyahu becomes vulnerable, not because Israel has suddenly collapsed, not because his opponents are doves, but because the public argument may be shifting from who is toughest to who can actually finish this, and that is a far more dangerous question for an incumbent in war. Now add the military picture back into this. Reuters reports that Israel's strikes into eastern Lebanon mark a significant expansion even after the ceasefire. Hezbollah, meanwhile, has kept launching attacks, including a drone strike on an Israeli tank, even if casualties were not reported in that particular case. More than 2,500 people have been killed in Lebanon since early March, according to Lebanese authorities cited by Reuters, and the conflict is clearly not behaving like a war that is cleanly de-escalating. So when people say Israel is at risk, the real meaning is not just territorial or military. The risk is strategic overextension. The risk is that Israel remains strong enough to strike, strong enough to retaliate, strong enough to expand operations, but not strong enough to make the whole regional picture stop generating new dangers. That is a very different kind of risk. And in some ways, it is more dangerous than the dramatic television version. Because this is not about one catastrophic breakthrough by the enemy. It is about Israel getting pulled into a pattern of repeated management without final resolution. One front cools slightly, another heats up. One ceasefire is announced, another condition unravels. One threat is degraded, another adapts. One rival is contained, then two rivals unite. That is how strategic fatigue begins, and strategic fatigue is where political orders start to wobble. Now here is the contradiction at the center of Netanyahu's position. On the one hand, he still wants to project confidence. AP reported yesterday that Netanyahu told army commanders Hezbollah's ability to fire into Israel had been sharply degraded, saying the group retained only around 10% of its arsenal, though he did not clearly define the baseline for that figure. On the other hand, the actual reporting on the ground shows that Hezbollah is still active, ceasefire violations persist, and Israeli strikes are expanding rather than ending. Reuters and AP have both reported that the Lebanon track remains unstable and entangled with broader U.S.-Iran diplomacy. That gap matters, because once public claims of success begin colliding with visible evidence of ongoing instability, political opponents get an opening. And Bennett and Lapid understand that. They are not offering a soft alternative. They are offering a competence challenge, a we would prosecute this struggle better challenge, a we would align force with diplomacy better challenge, a we would not leave Israel stuck in this half-finished state challenge. That can resonate powerfully in a country under stress, especially if the war keeps producing ambiguity instead of closure. Now, for an American audience, here is the simplest way to understand what this means. Imagine a president facing a live regional war, a shaky ceasefire, constant security warnings, and an electorate that is beginning to ask not whether he is tough, but whether he still has a path. That is where Netanyahu may be heading. Because Reuters reporting today makes one thing clear: his rivals are no longer operating as isolated critics. They are organizing into a serious political vehicle. And wartime alliances inside democracies are not random. They happen when political actors believe the public is ready to hear that the current leader is no longer the inevitable answer. That is the shock. Not that Netanyahu has opponents. He always has. Not that he is controversial. He always is. The shock is that the opposition now appears to think the moment is ripe to challenge him while the war is still unresolved. That means they smell vulnerability. And in politics, vulnerability is like blood in the water. Now let's go deeper, because there is another reason this matters. Even if Bennett and Lapid are hawkish, their alliance creates a different kind of pressure on Netanyahu's decision-making right now. If he feels politically threatened from the right, center, and security establishment at once, then the risk of overcorrection grows. He may feel tempted to escalate more aggressively to reclaim initiative. He may resist diplomatic flexibility for fear of appearing weak. He may broaden operations in Lebanon or harden terms elsewhere because domestic politics narrows his maneuvering room. That is how internal politics can become external risk. And when the country involved is Israel, armed, mobilized, and already operating in multiple theaters, that kind of political narrowing can have major regional consequences. This is one reason the Lebanon front matters so much. Reuters reported today that Israeli strikes into the Bekaa Valley were the first there since the ceasefire began, a sign that the conflict can still widen even after formal pauses are announced. That should worry everyone, because it tells you the system is still unstable enough that one side's effort to restore deterrence can quickly become the other side's proof that deterrence failed. And once you get trapped in that loop, the battlefield starts dictating politics. while politics simultaneously pushes the battlefield harder. That is the kind of loop Netanyahu may now be entering. And if so, the risks to Israel are not just immediate security risks. They are decision-making risks, because a government under simultaneous military and political pressure can start making choices not simply based on national interest, but on compressed timelines, coalition concerns, public anger, and the need to avoid looking indecisive. That does not mean those choices are irrational. It means they are made in a worse environment, and worse environments produce worse outcomes. Now let's talk about the ceasefire dimension, because this is crucial. The broader U.S.-Iran ceasefire framework has already looked fragile for days. Reuters and AP have both reported strains tied to Lebanon, Hormuz, and Iranian demands that any de-escalation must also encompass Hezbollah-related fighting. Israel, meanwhile, has at times made clear it does not see Lebanon as fully covered in the way others want. That means Netanyahu is operating inside a diplomatic environment where even ceasefire does not mean everyone shares the same definition, and that ambiguity is politically poisonous. Because if the public hears ceasefire but sees more strikes, then trust erodes. If allies hear de-escalation but see expansion, coordination becomes harder. If rivals hear victory but see continued mobilization, they start asking whether the war is being managed well at all. That is exactly the kind of climate in which opposition alliances become dangerous, not because they instantly overthrow a leader, but because they change how every new event is interpreted. A strike is no longer just a strike. It is also evidence for or against the government. A failed negotiation is no longer just diplomacy. It is also a political liability. A widened operation is no longer just a tactical response. It is also a test of whether Netanyahu is still choosing from strength or reacting under pressure. That is the new battlefield, and Netanyahu did not need it, not now, not with Hezbollah still active, not with Iran-related tensions still unresolved, not with Israel's military burden already high, not with the public already exhausted by years of overlapping crisis. So, is Israel at risk? Yes, but not in the cartoon sense. Not because the state is about to fall. Not because one opposition alliance changes the military balance overnight. Not because Netanyahu has suddenly lost all power. Israel is at risk because its strategic center may be entering a period of compression. Compression between politics and war. Compression between promises and outcomes. Compression between deterrence and endless management, compression between projecting strength and proving results. And those are exactly the conditions in which states start making more dangerous choices. That is why this moment matters. Because if Netanyahu feels the political ground shifting beneath him, while the Lebanon front stays active, and the wider regional picture stays unsettled, then the next moves out of Jerusalem could become harder, sharper, and less flexible than they otherwise would have been. And that is risky for Israel, risky for Lebanon, risky for the ceasefire, risky for Washington, risky for a region that is already one miscalculation away from a larger rupture. So the real shock Netanyahu may not have fully wanted right now is not merely that his opponents are talking louder, it is that they are becoming a credible structure at the exact moment his strategic environment is still unstable. And in war, structure matters more than noise. Anybody can criticize, not everybody can consolidate. Today, consolidation happened, and that means the next phase of this story will not be decided only by missiles, drones, or cross-border strikes. It will also be decided by whether Netanyahu can still convince Israelis that he is not just the man who knows how to survive crises, but the man who still knows how to end them. Because if he cannot make that case, then the danger to Israel is not only what comes from outside, it is what happens when a country under fire begins to lose confidence in the leadership trying to guide it through. And once that starts, the most dangerous risks are not always the ones you can intercept.